There's a moment from a past relationship that keeps coming back, not because it was dramatic or painful, but because of what was completely missed at the time. It happened on holiday. Everything felt relaxed, easy, genuinely enjoyable. And one morning, out of nowhere, he pulled close and said, "I don't ever want to live without you." And instead of melting into that, there was this strange freeze. A quiet internal voice said, "I love you, but I honestly cannot say the same thing back." And then almost immediately came the guilt. Why can't I say it? What is actually wrong with me? Because by every reasonable measure, he was a wonderful person, steady, warm, kind, and above all, safe to be around. There was no second guessing, no emotional chaos, no wondering where things stood. And yet, rather than leaning further in, something quietly began to pull away. Reasons were constructed, things like the age difference, uncertainty about the future, questions of long-term compatibility. It all felt very logical and very real. But looking back now, none of that was actually the truth. The relationship did not end because two people were wrong for each other. It ended because there was no understanding of what was actually happening internally, and by the time that understanding finally arrived, it was already too late. What follows is a closer look at what was really going on beneath the surface, because it was not obvious at the time and it was not intentional. Some people assume these patterns are choices. They are not. They are mechanisms, and understanding that distinction changes everything. On the surface, this was exactly the kind of relationship that seemed worth waiting for. It was not flawless, because nothing ever is, but there were no games, no confusion, no emotional push and pull. He was clear from the beginning. He called when he said he would. He made plans and followed through. There was never any need to wonder how he felt, because he showed it consistently. Most people would look at that and say, yes, that is exactly what a healthy relationship looks like. And it was. But at the same time, something felt absent. And at the time, that feeling seemed like important information, like a signal, like clarity. Now, though, there is a different question worth sitting with. Was something genuinely missing? Or was that just the avoidant part looking for any available exit? Because in the moment, it felt completely legitimate. It felt like seeing things clearly. And that is the part that was never questioned enough, because what came next began so gradually that it did not even register as withdrawal. The situation at the beginning was a little unconventional. Living abroad when the relationship started, and upon returning, a sublet arrangement meant staying with him temporarily, not officially moving in, but practically speaking, there every day. And for a while, it was completely comfortable, easy, natural. But after a few months, a thought crept in. This feels a bit flat. And if it feels this way now, what does another decade look like? Then the sublet ended, and moving back to a separate space meant seeing each other only on weekends. And that distance? It felt good, genuinely good. There was a sense of freedom again, of space and quiet and independence. The confusing part was that the interest had not disappeared. There was still something warm there, still genuine enjoyment when together. So it was not a clean break of feeling. It was murkier than that, which made it so much harder to read. And still, the focus kept drifting back to what seemed to be missing rather than what was clearly present. Then came that moment on the trip again, that hug, those words, and the freeze that followed. At the time, the interpretation was, see, this confirms it. This is not the right person. But that was not clarity speaking. That was something called deactivation. This is something that comes up a lot when learning about avoidant attachment. When emotional intimacy reaches a certain threshold, something in the nervous system can essentially shut down. Not because the feelings are gone, but because closeness itself gets read as pressure or even as a kind of threat. So rather than opening up further, a numbness sets in. A distance, a sudden uncertainty, and the mind, very helpfully, begins generating explanations for why this relationship probably is not right. And because the internal mechanism was not recognized for what it was, those explanations were completely believed. After returning from that trip, life filled back in. A couple of weekends away meant several weeks without seeing each other, and during that stretch, something was noticeably absent. The missing. There was no particular urge to call, no ache for closeness, no pull towards staying connected. If anything, the freedom felt welcome. And again, the internal voice said, that must mean something significant. But what was actually happening was a slow disconnection. Not deliberate, not conscious, just a quiet, steady withdrawal. What is regretted most now is the silence. The doubts were never shared. Nothing of the internal confusion was ever put into words, partly because vulnerability like that felt unsafe, and partly because of a long-standing belief that everything had to be figured out alone before it could be brought to another person. So nothing was said, and then one day, he ended it. There was no argument, no defining conversation, no clear moment of rupture. It just stopped. And the aftermath brought a long stretch of confusion about why the feelings never seemed to match what they were supposed to be. For a long time, the conclusion was simply that he was not the right person, that the real one just had not shown up yet. But when an honest look was taken at the full history of relationships, the same thread kept appearing. Interest in the beginning, slow withdrawal as things became real, increasing criticism, fixation on what was missing, feelings fading, or at least seeming to. This was not about one person. This was a pattern that had been running quietly for years. It just never got named until attachment theory came into the picture. Learning about attachment styles for the first time genuinely felt like reading a description of oneself. So for anyone unfamiliar with the concept, here is a brief version. There are 3 primary patterns. The first is secure attachment, where closeness feels safe and natural. Someone securely attached can connect, communicate openly, and remain present in a relationship without losing themselves in it. That is essentially the gold standard. The second pattern is anxious attachment, where there is a persistent fear of losing the relationship, a strong need for reassurance, and significant distress when distance or silence appears. And the third pattern, the one that resonated so personally, is avoidant attachment. It does not feel like not wanting love. It feels like wanting love right up until it becomes too real, and then something inside begins creating distance, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally. Doubt creeps in, boredom appears, interest seems to evaporate, and the mind constructs a convincing story that this relationship or this person simply is not the right fit. The most important thing to understand about this is that it is not a conscious decision. It forms early, usually in childhood, when emotional needs were not consistently met or when closeness did not feel reliably safe. The response learned was to become self-sufficient, to need less, to stay a little guarded. And that strategy works fine until someone genuinely available and consistent shows up. That is when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. That is exactly what happened in that relationship. Looking back now, what once felt like boredom looks entirely different. It looks like calm, it looks like stability, it looks like safety. And what becomes clear is how unfamiliar that actually felt. There is something important in that recognition. Sometimes what gets mistaken for a lack of chemistry is really just a lack of chaos. When someone has grown accustomed to emotional turbulence, steadiness can genuinely feel like something is wrong. Something else that stands out in hindsight is how much time was spent in analysis rather than expression. Everything was examined and questioned internally, but almost none of it was ever spoken aloud. If anything could be done differently, it would be that. Not perfectly, not with all the answers ready, but honestly. Something like, I notice part of me pulling back right now, and I do not fully understand why. Because staying silent did not protect the relationship. It dismantled it, slowly and invisibly. If any of this feels familiar, if some version of this pattern is recognizable in your own life, the important thing to know is that awareness creates a choice. Once the pattern is visible, something shifts. It is not an instant fix, but it is a beginning. Honestly, there has not been a relationship like that one since. Dating has been rare, partly because solitude feels genuinely comfortable, peaceful, safe, untriggered. But comfort and growth are not the same thing. Staying in a safe bubble means nothing actually changes. So on the rare occasions when a date does happen now, the approach is different. Instead of chasing immediate chemistry or waiting for a dramatic spark, the question is simpler. Does this feel calm? Does this feel safe? And even when the feeling is neutral at first, a second date still gets a yes, unless it was genuinely awful, because real connection does not always arrive instantly. Even on dating apps, the pattern is more visible now. When someone is consistent, when they show clear interest, that is often the exact moment the urge to pull back appears. The impulse to go quiet, to slow down replies, to let things fade. It is not good behavior. But the difference now is that it gets noticed. And noticing it changes how things play out, even in small ways. For a long time, the belief was that understanding the pattern would essentially dissolve it. That once the label was there, the behavior would stop. But it does not work that way. The pattern does not appear when life is quiet and solitary. It appears when real closeness is happening. That is the only place where it can actually be worked through. Reading about it helps. Watching things like this helps. Self-awareness genuinely matters. But the real shifts happen in the live moments, when the urge to disappear surfaces mid-conversation, when everything is going fine and then something subtle shifts and the instinct is to retreat. The practice now is to pause in that exact moment and ask, is this actually how I feel? Or is this just what always happens when someone gets a little closer? That pause is new. Before, there was no questioning it. Whatever the feeling was in the moment, it was treated as fact. And that is precisely why awareness alone is not the whole answer. In the moment, a pattern does not feel like a pattern. It feels like the truth. And that is why this kind of work can really only happen in relationship, not in isolation. Not when everything feels easy, but when something is genuinely being asked of you emotionally. That is where the pattern lives. That is also where healing becomes possible. The hardest part, the part that is still very much being figured out, is learning to trust feelings again. Because the real question is not simple. How do you know whether something is genuinely not right or whether it is just fear pretending to be clarity? That has not been fully resolved yet. And that uncertainty is honestly a little frightening because repeating the old pattern, slowly withdrawing and convincing oneself that something is wrong, only to realize later what was lost, is not something worth going through again. Some kind of outside support has been on the radar because this is not something that untangles itself through thinking alone. And it is becoming increasingly clear that actually nothing changes if nothing changes. Staying in the comfortable, peaceful, familiar space is easy. But easy is not the same as meaningful. If you recognize any of this in yourself, consider this an open invitation. Not to follow a specific path, but to start doing something differently than before. Whether that is one small conversation, one moment of honesty, or simply pausing the next time the urge to pull away shows up and asking yourself whether that feeling is truth or protection. Because the goal is not perfection. It is just to stop losing good things to patterns that were never consciously chosen in the first place. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.